Thank you very much, Tom. I appreciate the introduction. Good morning, everybody. My name is Amy Goletz. I am a Lake County Master Gardener volunteer, and I am also the chairperson for our annual Home Gardeners Workshop, and I never pass up an opportunity to plug it. Please mark your calendars and tell your friends. Our next workshop is March 6th, 2021 at Lakeland Community College. You can send us an email at mgblakecounty@gmail.com. That email is on your handout. It's a really fun day of learning. I'm also the chairperson of Bug Day at Lake Metro Parks, which is September 13th. We have some really cool insects on display, and you can see some native bees up close and personal. I am also an Ohio Certified Volunteer Naturalist, an Ohio Volunteer Pollinator Specialist. Both of these programs are run by The Ohio State University, and both are excellent programs. The VPS program is run by Denise Ellsworth, and raise your hand if you're a Denise groupie. The VPS meets once a month from February through November, traveling to arboretums and conservatories and conferences across the state. There's the website. Both of those websites are on your handout. I will caveat and say that I talked to Denise, and the 2021 program is going to be reserved for those participants who got shut out of the 2020 program by the COVID-19, but it would be worth adding your name to the waiting list. That photo is of wine cups or purple poppy mallow. It's a native mat-forming ground cover that grows in the sun. All of the photos of the plants you see in this presentation are not only native plants, but native plants selected specifically to attract bees to your garden. This slide also tells you who I am, and I suspect if you are watching this, you may share my attitude. My house is always a lot cleaner in the winter. Here is my agenda for the presentation. My goal is to have each of you running out to your local nursery to buy native plants that attract bees as soon as you leave this Zoom meeting. This photo is of a beautiful native plant called Anis hyssop. I have a large clump in my garden, and in late summer, the male bumblebees, who are not allowed to sleep in the bumblebee nest, sleep on my anise, and I can pet them while they are sleeping, which is really cool. Agastaki grows 2 to 4 feet tall and blooms June to September. It attracts not only bees, but hummingbirds and butterflies too. Let's start with the definition of native. Can you tell what the important words are? Adapted and co-evolved over evolutionary time. Evolutionary time refers to hundreds and thousands of years. So native plants and native bees are really good friends and deeply dependent on one another. The word native is usually used with a geographic qualifier, such as native to Ohio or native to North America. The more definite and specific the nativity, the better for the environment. For this presentation, when I say native, I mean native to North America. Now, how do you tell if a plant is native to your region? You look it up on the USDA plants database. And if you Google that, it's the first entry that comes up. The green color on the map tells us that Monarda fistulosa, commonly known as wild bergamot, is native to North America. If it was non-native or introduced, the map would be blue. So now we know it's not only native to North America, but also native to Ohio. Now that we know how to tell if a plant is native, let's move on to the why you should plant natives. The most important reason to plant native plants is that they support the local food web. Native plants provide food, shelter, and places for wildlife to raise their young. Native plants like nodding onion provide nectar and pollen for pollinators. Nodding onion will naturalize by self-seeding, but you can deadhead after flowering to control the spread It blooms June to August. Native plants like New Jersey tea are host plants. Host plants are plants on which butterflies lay their eggs and which provide a food source for the emerging caterpillars. 90% of the insects that eat plants can develop and reproduce only on the plants with which they evolved. New Jersey tea is a host plant for the spring azure butterfly. And native plants like elderberries provide seeds, fruits, and insects for birds and wildlife. Many birds love to eat elderberries, and if you want them for a pie, which is delicious, you have to act faster than those hungry birds. Native plants are naturally adapted to the climate, rainfall, and soils of your region. Their roots extend much deeper into the soil than the roots of many non-native plants, including turfgrass, which means natives are more drought resistant and absorb more water. When planted in the appropriate site conditions, native plants require less fertilizer, less pesticides, less water, and less maintenance. How could you not like that? The less inputs plants require, the more sustainable your garden and the better for the environment. Natural enemies are beneficial insects that provide natural pest control in your garden, and native plants attract these natural enemies. There are battles going on in your garden that I bet you weren't aware of. My Tradescantia, which is commonly known as spiderwort, is blooming right now, and that blue is just absolutely beautiful. So this is a list of native plants that attract natural enemies, and I got this list from a book written by Mary Gardner from the Ohio State University called Good Garden Bugs. I would highly recommend the list. I believe that list is on your list of resources, the list of resources on your handout. Here are some examples of natural enemies. These are good garden bugs that you definitely want in your garden. Natural enemies predate or parasitize pest insects. In the upper left corner, you see a photo of a syrphid or a hoverfly, and they look a lot like a bee, don't they? But let me share with you the differences of a bee versus a fly. Bees have 2 pairs of wings, where a fly has only 1 pair. Bees have eyes on the side of their head, where fly eyes often meet at the top of their head. Bees have long antennae, fly antennae are short, and bees are generally much hairier than flies. An invasive plant is a non-native plant that outcompetes our native plant for space, light, nutrients, and water. Not all non-native plants are invasives, but all invasive plants are non-native. Invasive plants do not support our local food web as they haven't been here long enough to establish relationships with our native insects. If your garden is full of native plants, there will be no room for invasives to grow. And if you do have invasives in your garden, please help the environment and our native pollinators and take them out. ODNR has a list of Ohio's top invasive plants. These 4 plants are on that list. And I was pleased to be able to find a photo of a bee on an invasive plant because it brings up a good point. Plants offer different qualities of nectar and pollen. A bee feeding on a non-native plant is like us eating fast food. It's just not healthy. And just because a plant has not yet made it onto Ohio's list of top invasive plants does not mean the plant is not invasive. Butterfly bush is a non-native plant from Asia. It has no natural predators here, and so it is able to easily outcompete our native plants. It does have nectar for butterflies, but not one native caterpillar is able to eat it, thus it does not contribute anything to the local food web. It self-seeds in natural areas, and it would be much kinder to your ecosystem to replace that butterfly bush with a native plant such as New England aster, summer sweet, or dense blazing star, all of which do contribute to the local food webs and still attract butterflies. Summer sweet is my favorite shrub. I think it's just beautiful and the fragrance is lovely. It blooms July through August and attracts not only bees, but hummingbirds and butterflies too. Why is genetic diversity important? Because plant populations must have genetic diversity to be able to adapt to naturally adapt to stresses such as diseases or climate change. Plants know, excuse me, please know that plant DNA moves from our yard into natural areas. When the plants in our yard are native, their DNA can make a positive contribution to the survival of wild plant populations. If the plants in our yards are cultivars or non-natives, that DNA may negatively affect the wild plant populations. A cultivar is a plant variety that has been produced by humans by selective breeding. Most cultivars are propagated through tissue culture instead of seed, which produces clones or genetically identical plants. With no genetic diversity and genes artificially manipulated by breeders, cultivars have less capacity to adapt to change. So plant native plants like our pale purple coneflower, which has such a unique droopy flower head, and butterfly milkweed, which is not only a host plant for the monarch butterfly, but attracts bees as well, and false sunflower, which grows in a 3 to 4 foot clump and does not lose its ray flowers as a true sunflower does. All three of these flowers bloom roughly at the same time. What a beautiful combination, isn't it? Another reason to plant native plants is to preserve the natural character of a region. Native plants are unique to your geographic region, so they create a distinct sense of place. When you plant natives, you celebrate your natural history. And last but not least, in addition to all that, native plants are just beautiful. Here is the Monarda fistulosa I used as an example for the USDA plants database. It is a member of the mint family and very popular with native bees and natural enemies. Rattlesnake master is an architectural plant whose leaves resemble yucca leaves. And despite how prickly those blooms look, they attract many bees, native bees, and natural enemies. And you can use rattlesnake master as a prop to hold up other floppy native plants. Purple prairie clover grows 1 to 3 feet tall. It is a member of the legume family, which means it fixes nitrogen into the soil, which is a very good thing. Now, on to our native bees. We have approximately 500 species of bees in Ohio. That number is an estimate because we are still finding and identifying bees. I must say right now that honeybees are not native and will not be discussed in this presentation. Here is a one-slide crash course on native bees. 90% of native bees are solitary. Being a solitary bee means that there is no colony. Each mated female builds a nest, gathers food, and lays her eggs all by herself. Of course, there's always an exception, and that is the social bumblebee who does live in a colony with a queen and worker bee. Native bees are short-lived and fly for only 5 to 8 weeks of the year. The bees you see in spring are not the same bees that you see flying in late summer. Most native bees are specialists, which means they collect pollen and nectar from one genus or one family of plants. So it is important to grow the native plants those bees are looking for, or else we lose the bee. And because native bees are solitary and have no colony to defend, they are not aggressive and they will not sting unless they are threatened. 70% of native bees are ground nesters. Others live in pre-existing cavities, such as rodent burrows or beetle holes in rotting wood. This is a graphic created by Heather Holm, who wrote an amazing book called Native Plants for Native Bees. I was looking for it. I was going to show it to you. It is on your resource handout. This graphic shows a solitary, non-aggressive mommy bee with her nest of eggs underground versus the yellow jacket, who has an entire colony underground, which they are willing to defend aggressively. Here are two large bees that I hope you are seeing in your garden, the bumblebee and the carpenter bee. They are both about the same size, but bumblebee bodies are very hairy, while the abdomen or bum of a carpenter bee has no hair and appears shiny. So we say carpenter bees have shiny heinies. Also, please let me put in a good word for carpenter bees, which often dive bomb and fly erratically around humans. These divers are male bees, which are territorial but harmless because male bees do not have stingers. Only female bees have stingers because stingers are a modified egg-laying organ. Female carpenter bees are docile and sting only if handled. So don't be alarmed if a carpenter bee starts dive bombing you. Just thank him for being a good pollinator. There are 16 different species of bumblebees in Ohio. The most common species is the appropriately named common eastern bumblebee, Bombus impatiens. This chart of the bumblebees of Illinois, which we can use as we have the same bumblebee species, shows the different patterns of yellow, black, and brown on our bumblebees. So look closely at the next bumblebee you see. They are not all the same. Mason bees are so named because some species of mason bees make their nests with mud. Mining bees create burrows in the soil. You know, before I advance my slide, let me point out the beautiful pink pollen on the mining bee. It's important to know and interesting to realize that different flowers have different color pollen. So when you're looking at bees close up, you might see them covered in pink or white or yellow or orange. These are more native bees to Ohio. The sweat bee on the left is called a sweat bee because it likes to lick the sweat off of humans. The cellophane bee in the middle, isn't he cute? Is so called because the female bees apply a glue or cellophane-like lining to the walls of the nest cells that she builds. And the third photo on the right is a small carpenter bee. It's a different species of bee than the larger carpenter bee. The small carpenter bee likes to nest in old wood, but there has to be a cavity in the wood already because she is too small to chew a hole for herself. And here's an interesting bee that you may have seen evidence of in your garden. It is the alfalfa leafcutter bee, who chews circular cutouts from leaves and carries them back to her nest and uses them for her brood cells. She tends to use rose, lilac, violets, and Virginia creeper leaves. And oh my goodness, isn't he cute? Who wouldn't want that little face in their garden? She's smiling at us. She is a squash bee, and if you grow it, she will come. To help you identify a bee, if you are so inclined, pay attention not only to coloration, the behavior, the size and what flower they're visiting, but where they are carrying their pollen. And I say she's carrying her pollen, I should say, because all worker bees are female. Bees can carry their pollen on their legs, like a bumblebee, under their abdomen, like the alfalfa leafcutter bee, or under their arms, like a mining bee. Okay, I'd like to share with you 8 tips to create a bee-friendly habitat. If you follow these tips to create, to attract bees, you will attract other pollinators too. I have highlighted bees not only because that is what my presentation is on, and they are my favorite pollinator, but because bees are the most effective and efficient pollinators. Bees are the only pollinators who intentionally collect pollen and nectar, as they use both to make bee bread, which is a ball of pollen and nectar that an egg is laid upon. That one little ball contains everything a bee needs to grow from an egg to an adult. Bees are the only pollinator group that feeds exclusively on nectar and pollen throughout their entire life cycle. One note about butterflies. I know a lot of people like to garden for butterflies, and that is great. Butterflies visit flowers to feed on nectar, but they do not intentionally seek or collect pollen, so they're not considered a reliable pollinator. However, if you're gardening for butterflies, again, you are attracting other pollinators like bees too. I'd like to call your attention to the beautiful Helen's flower in the photo. It is also called sneeze weed, but that name is entirely misleading. It does not make one sneeze, but was used in the making of snuff oh so long ago. Sneezeweed grows 3 to 5 feet tall and blooms August to October, providing nectar and pollen in the fall for our pollinators. It's a beautiful plant. Tip number 1, the ideal pollinator gardener will have several different plants in bloom from early spring through late fall. We have bees that emerge in the spring and others that emerge later in the summer. And bumblebees produce multiple generations each year and need pollen and nectar throughout the entire growing season. Let's talk for a moment about the annual life cycle of a bumblebee colony so you see what I mean. Starting at the top of the photo at number 1, a mated bumblebee queen emerges from winter hibernation in early spring. After finding a new nest and foraging for nectar and pollen, she creates wax pots to hold and incubate her eggs. Her first brood is all daughters who take over the foraging duties. The queen does not leave the nest again. Subsequent generations of females develop throughout the summer. In the fall, new queens and males are produced and leave the colony to find mates. Newly mated queens hibernate over the winter, and the rest of the colony dies. So you can see by that life cycle, we do need nectar and pollen all year long. You should choose a variety of plants with overlapping bloom times. Here is a sampling of plants, but the possibilities are endless. Bloodroot emerges in spring with the leaves wrapped around the flower. It's quite beautiful. Golden Alexander, which blooms May through June, is a member of the carrot family. Blue vervain produces large quantities of nectar and has candelabra flower spikes that bloom from the bottom up. And asters and goldenrods are pollinator magnets in August and October. When planning your garden, think about serving up a menu of blooms from early spring through fall. I like to eat all year long, don't you? So do our native bees. Here is a problem. Our queen bumblebee, as we have learned, emerges from her winter hibernation in early spring, when our perennial gardens are not in bloom yet. So what is a mommy bumble to do? She relies on us to plant native, spring blooming trees. Tree blossoms provide an excellent food source. Trees like serviceberry can be grown as a small tree or a large shrub. The flowers appear before the leaves, which have a beautiful fall color. Pussy willows are dioecious, which means there are male and female trees. They are a magnet for pollinators, as are basswoods, which attracts so many bees. The tree is nicknamed the bee tree. Tulip trees have beautiful flowers, which no one really notices until the petals fall to the ground because the flowers are up so high. Both of these trees are rich in pollen and nectar, as is our beautiful red maple. If you're interested in planting trees for bees, especially spring blooming trees for bees, I would recommend you read Denise's fact sheet, Ohio Trees for Bees, and the link is on your handout. Tip number 2, plant flowers in clumps of at least 3 plants. You want to help pollinators find your food source by planting in clumps rather than single plantings. For those that want to attract butterflies, know that butterflies are attracted to color. Large masses of color are more easily visible from the air. Spotted bee balm on the right side of the screen is one of my new favorite plants. Isn't that flower interesting? Spotted or dotted bee balm attracts bees and natural enemies. It's fragrant and blooms June to July and grows up to 2 feet tall. Another reason to plant in clumps is for the bees. Bees practice flower fidelity. Flower fidelity or flower constancy is the behavior of bees where they remain faithful to the same species of flowers on one foraging trip. So a bee will fly and forage on a geranium flower, then visit another geranium flower and another geranium flower, and so on, and then back to the nest to unload. On her next foraging trip, that same bee may go from a coreopsis to a coreopsis to a coreopsis, then back to the nest to unload. She will not forage first on a geranium, then on a coreopsis, then a mountain mint, then a black-eyed Susan. Why? Well, 1, because I chose flowers that are not all blooming at the same time, but 2, because of flower fidelity. Why do bees practice flower fidelity? Bees must remember where each nectar store is located in each flower and what obstacles must be overcome to get it. How do I work this flower to get my food? It is thought that it is easier for the bee to memorize the details of just one flower at a time. Flower fidelity is another reason why bees are the most efficient and effective pollinators. Flower fidelity means pollen stays within a species of flower and is not wasted on a different species that can't use it. Planting in clumps makes it easy on the bees because all the floral resource she wants are in one place. Tip number 3, research before using cultivars. If our native bees have evolved with the native echinacea over hundreds and thousands of years, how is a hungry little bee supposed to know how to work the relatively new cultivar, Echinacea razzmatazz? She doesn't. Plants bred with double flower petals like razzmatazz are often inaccessible to pollinators. They just can't find the nectar. And while creating the perfect blooms for people, plant breeders have often left out the pollen and nectar entirely in some cultivars. How do you know if a plant is a cultivar? By the name. Cultivar names are surrounded by single quotation marks. But of course, like I said before, there's always exceptions. There are some cultivars that are okay to use. Doug Tallamy is a professor at the University of Delaware, and he is the author of Bringing Nature Home, which is an excellent book that I would highly recommend reading. He studied cultivars of native trees and shrubs and found that changes in plant size or habit, such as growing more compactly or more upright than straight species, didn't seem to make any difference to wildlife. Neither did breeding for disease resistance. However, cultivars where native green leaves were changed to another color leaf did make a difference to wildlife. Annie White from the University of Vermont did her research on nativars, which is a cultivar of a native plant, and found that one nativar, the purple flowered Culver's root, actually attracted more pollinators than the straight species and had a longer bloom time. So it is important to do your research. Tip number 4, diversity in the in the garden is very important. Bees typically visit flowers whose corolla depth, or the depth of the grouping of the flower petals, match their tongue lengths, which can vary from 2 to 14 millimeters. Long-tongued bees and long-beaked hummingbirds prefer to forage on plants with long, tubular-shaped flowers, such as the penstemon, bee balm, phlox, and salvias. Short-tongued bees prefer to forage on open flowers. Nope. Short-tongued bees prefer to forage on flowers that have a shorter corolla length, like our Virginia mint. And then other pollinators, which are not as agile in flight as our bees, like beetles, prefer to forage on landing pad flowers, which are just flowers which have a wide floral surface for them to land on. Those flowers include black-eyed Susan, asters, purple coneflowers, and yarrow. Here are 2 more examples of how different flower shapes accommodate, or not, different pollinators. The photo on the left is a Where's Waldo puzzle. Can you see the bee? The bumble has crawled inside the turtle head to get to the nectar. Turtle heads are pollinated only by bees strong enough to pry open that flower. So bumblebees and longhorned bees are the primary visitors. And the hungry carpenter bee on the right is too big to crawl into the salvia flower. So to get to the nectar, she is utilizing a practice known as nectar robbing. She chews a hole in the base of the flower and laps the nectar from the outside without pollinating the flower. This is not what the flower wants to happen. Not only are they not pollinated by the carpenter bee, but the holes make the flower unattractive to other bees that would have properly pollinated the flower. A variety of colors is also necessary to attract different pollinators. Bees do not see red well and are attracted to shades of pink, purple, and blue. Their secondary preference is white or yellow flowers. Tip number 5, provide natural nesting sites. Bunch grasses are grasses that grow in clumps. Native bunch grasses provide seeds for birds, host plants for butterflies, and nesting material for bees. Bumblebees will frequently nest under clump-forming grasses like switchgrass and big blue stem, little blue stem, and prairie dropseed. Miscanthus is not a native grass and crowds out our native grasses in the wild. There are states that have listed miscanthus as an invasive. And I know bee hotels are popular these days, but bee boxes and bee hotels are not the best for bees because they can carry diseases from year to year if not cleaned properly. They also congregate large number of bees in one place, making them vulnerable to predators and parasites. So instead of purchasing artificial structures, why not use what you already have in your yard? Most native bees are ground nesting. Ground nesting bees need bare soil that is loose, well drained, and in a sunny location. Go easy on the mulch. Need an excuse to be lazy in the fall? Here it is. Leaf litter and plant debris play an important role in the life cycle of many bees, butterflies, moths, and birds. Many pollinators overwinter in leaf litter. Leaf litter also protects plants, eliminates the need for mulch, and adds nutrients to the soil. So leave the leaves. Bees build nests in hollow plant stems from the previous growing season, like aster, bee balm, goldenrod, and thistle. If you are interested in providing habitat for stem nesting bees, I would encourage you to go to Heather Holmes' website, which is on your handout. She has just created a wonderful new graphic on how to do this. It's easy and natural. And I know we gardeners can't wait to get outside on the first warm day of the year to work in our yard, but please do not clean up until late spring. Pollinators need 3 to 4 consecutive days over 50 degrees in the spring before they emerge. So next year, allow the pollinators a chance to emerge unharmed before cleaning up. And not only am I recommending you to leave the leaves and leave your stems, but leave the weeds. Of course, native plants are much more nutritious than weeds, but bees will still enjoy a good dead nettle drink. Tip number 6, being pesticide-free is very important for a pollinator garden. Even organic pesticides can pose a very serious threat to pollinators. Most of us would not intentionally spray bumblebees or butterflies with insecticides, but we may use chemicals harmful to pollinators without realizing what we are doing. Pesticides may kill bees and natural enemies outright, or they may affect behavior and susceptibility to disease. Systemic pesticides are taken up by the plant and may be found in pollen and nectar. Pesticide dusts can be mistaken for pollen grains by the bee and taken back by the bee to the nest. I would encourage you to read labels carefully before purchasing a pesticide, and remember, the label is the law. If you must use a pesticide, use the least toxic material possible. Spray at night when bees and other pollinators are not active. Instead of using pesticides, consider relying on the natural enemies that native plants attract. I'd like to share my experience with you. I have a native pussy willow tree that was infested with giant willow aphids, seen on the right. I do not like to use chemicals in my garden, but they were huge and they were everywhere. So I did my research and found an insecticidal soap that was the least toxic choice. I went out with my bottle ready to spray, but before I started spraying, I noticed something very interesting. Lady beetles and lady beetle larvae were everywhere. I held off on spraying the soap and watched with great fascination. Within 2 days, those giant willow aphids were gone. The natural enemies had won the battle, and I was a little ashamed of myself. Who was I to interfere with nature and deprive those lady beetle larvae of a delicious feast? It was a great reminder for me to leave nature alone. Tip number 7 is to provide a water source. Bees need a drink of water just like we do, so a good bee-friendly habitat will provide water for them. You can have a bird bath filled with stones or turtles for the bees to perch on while drinking, because bees do not swim. You can mist your plants in a drought and the bees will drink from the droplets of water. Or you can plant a cup plant. It is a tall, sun-loving plant with leaves that clasp the stem and hold water so bees can drink. I have also found tree frogs on my cup plant. Now that you have planted your native plants, you can sit back and enjoy your visitors. Okay, I have some cool facts about bees I'd like to share with you. Cool fact number 1, a bee's gender can be determined by counting the segments on its antenna. If a bee is female, she will have 10 segments on her antenna, and a male will have 11 segments. So let's count. Here's 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. It's a boy. Cool fact number 2, bee mothers have the amazing ability to determine the gender of the eggs they lay. If a mother wants a girl, she fertilizes the egg. And if a mother wants a boy, she withholds the sperm and the unfertilized egg will develop into a male. It is also interesting to note that male eggs are laid near the nest entrance, as males in the bee world are considered rather expendable. So if a hungry woodpecker should come, the females are safe at the back of the nest. Cool fact number 3, bees have 5 eyes. The larger eyes, number 1 and 2, are compound eyes with thousands of lenses. Through these eyes, bees see color, shape, and light. Near the top of the head, bees have 3 simple eyes called ocelli. These eyes just have 1 lens. Bees use these eyes for triangulating on the position of the sun to guide them back to their nests. Cool fact number 4, many bee-pollinated flowers have stripes or guides that a bee can see, but we cannot, because bees can see ultraviolet light. The ultraviolet pattern is called a nectar guide and helps a bee quickly locate the flower's center and the nectar and pollen. In some flowers, like the penstemon, the nectar guides are visible to us. Do you notice the delicate purple lines in the throat? Those guide the bees to the nectar. And cool fact number 5, it's electric. As bees fly through the air, they bump into charged particles, and the friction of these microscopic collisions causes the bee to end up with a positive charge. Flowers, on the other hand, tend to have a negative charge. When the positively charged bee arrives at the negatively charged flower, pollen literally jumps from the flower to the bee even before the bee has landed. And the bees change the charge of whatever flower they have landed on. So a bee can tell whether a flower has been recently visited by another bee and might be short of nectar by the flower's changed electrical field. It's like a sign that says, closed for lunch, be right back. The flower takes about the same amount of time to replenish the nectar as the time it takes for the charge to return to negative, letting the bees know, I'm full of nectar again, time for pollination. What you plant in your gardens makes a difference. Please make it a positive difference. And goodness, we're already at the last agenda point. If you need help in identifying a plant or an insect, the Lake County Master Gardener volunteers are here to help. Our helpline is manned by volunteers Tuesday mornings from 9 to 11, April through October. At other times, feel free to leave a message on our voicemail or shoot us an email. You can also use iNaturalist, an app for your phone. You upload a photo and the app suggests an identification. Project experts also scroll through the app, helping to identify observations. The Missouri Botanical Garden Plant Finder website is an excellent resource that I use all the time. It has growing information. It has information on the history of the plants. It also has, which is very helpful, the pronunciation of Latin names and a link to the Invasive Plant Atlas where applicable. The Lady Bird Johnson Wildflower Center Plant Database lists only plants native to North America. So if your plant is found here, you know it is a native. Lady Bird Johnson also includes a plant's value to beneficial insects, courtesy of the Xerces Society. Here are a few websites for more information. beelab.osu.edu has a lot of information on native bees. And Heather Holmes' website, pollinatorsnativeplants.com, has beautiful posters that can be downloaded for free and which list native plants for native bees in different soil types. Here's a list of books that anyone interested in native plants or bees would enjoy reading, and this list is on your handout. And now, to send you off properly, here is where you can go to find a list of native plant nurseries. I'm sorry this was not included on your handout, but if you go to that website, it lists native plant nurseries in Ohio. You do want to make sure you pay attention to the listing because it does list wholesale buyers too. So you might want to either make sure it's for retail or call them ahead to make sure you can get what you want. All right, that's it for me. Thank you for listening and have a beautiful day.
Oh,
Do we have questions, Tom?